"We will not be slaves to a distant king." Those words weren't just a slogan, they were the heartbeat of a revolution. And no one shouted them louder than Samuel Adams. Most people today know his name from a beer label, but in the 1700s, Samuel Adams was the agitator who turned taverns into political battlegrounds, who transformed protests into movements, and who helped spark the fire that gave birth to the United States. Born on September 27, 1722, he lived a life fueled by one unshakable belief: liberty is worth any price. Samuel Adams grew up in Boston, the son of a merchant who was also deeply involved in local politics. In his Puritan household, the values of faith, duty, and resistance to injustice were ever present. At Harvard, Adams showed his radical streak early. His thesis? The right of people to resist government if it became oppressive. At just 21 years old, he was already laying the intellectual foundation for revolution. But Samuel Adams wasn't a polished gentleman like his cousin John. He was perpetually broke, careless in business, and far more comfortable among ordinary workers than in the halls of wealth. What he lacked in money, he made up for in passion. And that passion soon found a home in the taverns of Boston. In 18th century Boston, taverns were more than drinking spots. They were the social networks of the day, places where sailors, merchants, and craftsmen gathered to debate news and politics. Adams thrived there. He had a rare gift, the ability to turn complicated issues into fiery, simple language that spoke to the people. He wrote anonymous essays in newspapers, stirring anger against British taxes. He stood on tavern tables and turned frustration into conviction. That's why the beer connection today is more than marketing, it's symbolic. Adams didn't spend his life brewing ale, but he did brew rebellion. The first great test came in 1765 with the Stamp Act, which taxed newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. For Adams, this wasn't just about money, it was about principle. How could colonists be taxed by a parliament 3,000 miles away where they had no say? Adams rallied resistance, organizing protests and forming the Sons of Liberty. Their tactics were sometimes rough, tarring and feathering tax collectors. But Adams believed the British needed to see the depth of colonial outrage. He declared, "The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution, are worth defending at any hazards." And from that moment, there was no turning back. In March 1770, British troops fired into a Boston crowd, killing 5 colonists. To some, it looked like a riot gone wrong. To Samuel Adams, it was a gift of narrative. He branded it the Boston Massacre, framing it as deliberate murder. Through pamphlets and speeches, he spread outrage far beyond Massachusetts. Adams proved that revolutions aren't won by muskets alone. They're won with words that strike the soul. 3 years later came his most famous act. Britain's tax on tea may have been small, but to Adams it symbolized submission. On December 16, 1773, thousands gathered at Boston's Old South Meeting House. Adams stood before them, urging resistance. That night, the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the harbor. Adams didn't throw the tea himself, but he orchestrated the event. He later called it the most magnificent movement of all. To Britain, it was vandalism. To America, it was freedom in action. By the 1770s, Samuel Adams was no longer just a Boston firebrand. He became a delegate to the Continental Congress, pushing for full independence when many still hoped for reconciliation. He wasn't the general like Washington, nor the eloquent pen like Jefferson, nor the diplomat like Franklin. But Adams was the relentless voice, the man who refused to let compromise dull the call for liberty. And when the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, his name was there, a permanent mark on the birth of a nation. After the Revolution, Adams continued in politics, eventually serving as governor of Massachusetts. Unlike some of his peers, he never chased wealth or power. He lived modestly, dedicated to the idea that liberty must be safeguarded even in peace. His cousin John Adams once wrote, "Without the character of Samuel Adams, the true history of the American Revolution can never be written." Today, when most people hear Samuel Adams, they think of beer. And while that might seem trivial, it's also fitting. His legacy was forged in taverns, among ordinary people, where his words stirred the first sparks of independence. Samuel Adams showed that revolutions don't begin only on battlefields or in palaces. They begin in crowded rooms, over mugs of ale, when ordinary men and women decide they will not live as subjects, but as citizens. Samuel Adams, born September 27, 1722, lived a life that proved one voice can change the world. He was flawed, stubborn, often broke, sometimes extreme, but he was also fearless, persuasive, and unwilling to bend to tyranny. So the next time you see his name, don't just think of the beer. Think of the man who declared, "We will not be slaves to a distant king." Because Samuel Adams wasn't just a brewer of ale, he was a brewer of liberty.